Hey guys, it's Will. It's Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. Welcome back to the channel. If you are new to the channel, welcome to the channel. If you feel like subscribing, giving us a thumbs up, a like, comment, all that fun stuff, that would be much appreciated. Thank you very much. Let's jump right into the video. I just had a buttload of Chinese food for lunch. I'm ready to talk about martial arts films. And ooh baby, do I have a martial arts film for you? Hell yes. First of all, can we all pause and just appreciate this artwork? This is amazing. I love this. This is by, and the name is right here on the back, Ilan Shidi, and I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, but come on, this is so cool. I love this. It's got so much energy to it, and it's such a great representation of the film. The film is One Arm Boxer, and this is the Arrow release, and this is a Region A release. Hell yes. It really feels like 2022 is like the dawn of a great era in Region A releases of Hong Kong films and martial arts films. We got the Come Drink With Me release from Arrow that came out earlier this year, the Arrow Shotscope Volume 1 set, which I believe is the end of last year. 88 Films is now releasing stuff in the US, so we got Chinese Boxer from them, a bunch of other Shaw Brothers movies, Legendary Weapons of China, and I think one of the Mantis movies, Mantis Kung Fu, or Shaolin Mantis, one of those two, and Martial Club is coming up, and Human Lanterns, I think, comes out in May, which is the same month. And this is a May of 2022 release. So this is a brand stinking new release from Arrow. Hell to the yes. So if you watch this channel, you'll know that I love this movie because I reviewed the Eureka release of it last year. I think this came out in July of 2021. So that's the Eureka release of One Arm Boxer, and this is the Arrow release. So, you know, Eureka is Region B, so this is a Region A release, and it's got all the stuff that's on the Eureka release with the exception of the essay. There's different booklets, or essays in the booklet, excuse me. But other than that, this has the features from that release, and it has a really, really exciting extra feature, which is a 41-minute long interview with the man, the myth, the legend, Jimmy Wang Yu, who, like I said, wrote and directed this film, stars in this film.
I'm the one of the three. Yeah, that's the whole procedure from a swimming play to become a movie actor. The first movie, I'm the leading actor. What they call Tiger Boy. This is like a testing film. It's black and white. It's not a color. And the director is also new face. We both has opportunity to make this kind of a movie.
This came out in 1971. This is a Golden Harvest film, so this was made after Jimmy Wang Yu left Shaw Brothers for Golden Harvest, moved to Taiwan. I can talk all about the drama regarding that when I get into the bonus feature. So because I've already reviewed this film on the channel, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my very brief kind of synopsis of the film and some very brief thoughts in case you didn't see my other review, but I'm not going to do like a total in-depth review because like I said, when I reviewed that release, and this was one of my favorite releases of last year, and this came out within like 6 months, I think, of the Chinese Boxer coming out, and by this I mean the Eureka one. This came out last July, I believe, and then I think in December or November, we got the Chinese Boxer from 88 Films, and now we have this release. And then the Basher box also came out from the Pearl River, which is, I think, Michael Worth's imprint. And so all of these releases with all the bonus features and everything give a really incredible overview of basically like the birth of modern Kung Fu films, the kind of Basher genre that came out of that. Bruce Lee, King Boxer, you know, which King Boxer is in the Shawscope set. So all the bonus features on that too, like you get a really well-rounded view of like the dawn of modern Kung Fu films as they broke away from the wuxia films and became like a separate thing of like hand-to-hand combat, hard-hitting, violent, aggressive, grindhousey like types of films, and how that moved into, you know, people like Sammo Hung kind of came along, and how that moved into like the 80s films that we know. And you like through all of these releases, and this one especially because Jimmy Wang Yu has a 41-minute interview on here, you really get this really great overview of the evolution of these films. So to talk about this film, if you're not familiar with the plot, you have the character played by Jimmy Wang Yu, who is a student at a martial arts school, and there's a rival school in the town, and the rival school are the bad guys. They're like dealing opium, and they're very, very bad. And they want to get rid of the good school so they can be the only gang in town, basically, right? And so they start this fight, and the head of the good guy school gives a whooping to the head of the bad guy school. And then he gets really pissed. He's like, oh no, you're not going to get the better of me. So he collects martial artists from all over Asia, and so you get the Japanese guy. As you can see, he has fangs. It's like a degree of anti-Japanese sentiment that's like so absurd that it's kind of funny. And this is the theme in Jimmy Wang Yu's films, in Chinese Boxer and in One Arm Boxer. And it's interesting because in the interview, Jimmy Wang Yu talks about how much he loved Japanese films and working with Japanese people. And for Beach of the War Gods, they imported props from Japan because they thought their props were better than the ones they had available to them. He has like tremendous respect for Japan, Japanese people, and Japanese movies. But because of what happened with World War II, because Jimmy Wang Yu is from China, he's from Shanghai, and so what happened in China during World War II at the hands of the Japanese was just horrible. And this was only 25 years later, and there's all of these horrible cultural memories, PTSD, like all of this is still lingering in the culture. And so the Japanese are a very easy enemy. If you're in the same way that we would use the Germans in the United States as easy enemies to get a rise out of the audience, to get them emotionally invested in the film, it's very easy to use the Japanese. And Frank Zhang actually says on his commentary here that there are certain terms that characters in this film use that are referencing World War II. And it's the Sino-Japanese War. In the US, we think of it as the Pacific theater of World War II, but it was really the Sino-Japanese War, right? And the occupation of places in China and the occupation of Hong Kong by the Japanese, and like Manchuria as well as like another place where lots of horrible stuff happened. So they're using specific language in this film to reference that. And so and Jimmy Wang Yu talks in his interview here, and I know I'm getting off track of telling you what the movie's about, but I'm just kind of rolling with the punches here. Jimmy Wang Yu talks in the interview here about bringing the audience into the film, hooking them, getting them interested, in how they've become so accustomed to so many types of films so quickly throughout the 60s and 70s that how do you keep them interested, and how do you keep upping the stakes, and how do you keep upping the ante as a filmmaker and bringing in these very bad villains and having an automatic point of reference for the audience is very, very helpful. So you have this Japanese bad guy who comes in, and you get, these are Tibetan monks, and then you get this yogi martial arts guy from India, and this is the kind of like the guy who runs the bad guy school. And then, they all come together, or they're hired by the bad guy. Basically, he offers them like a percentage of the opium trade to take out the good guy school. But they make a mistake. Somebody escapes. And ooh baby, does he get his revenge. So it's a pretty simple movie, but I think this movie is fantastic. If you're a fan of old school martial arts films, you're going to love it because it's nonstop fighting. Now, if you are a pure, true, actual martial artist, you're going to think the fighting in this movie is preposterous because it's not real martial arts, right? This is something that people talk about with Jimmy Wang Yu. He wasn't really a martial artist. He supposedly, according to him, he studied martial arts when he was a kid and he stopped. There are some people who say he never took martial arts at all. That was just part of his legend of like building himself up, right? But Jimmy Wang Yu, as a filmmaker, uses filmmaking techniques to create visceral cinema. And he's using a lot of techniques that you see in Japanese cinema too. He uses silence, he uses slow camera movements, he uses gaps in his fights, he uses a lot of dramatic devices that are typical to writing in his fight scenes. There's a reason for the fight, and then the fight, something will happen that will escalate the fight, and then the emotional stakes get more intense. Like each fight tells a story between the characters who are fighting and advances the movie as well. He's a really fantastic storyteller. He's very, very good with narrative and with using the kind of the tropes of action and martial arts films, which are action scenes, fight scenes, and like the intensity of the rivalries and the violence to advance the story. So he's moving you along, not stopping you for the fight scenes. And I think that to me makes him a really incredible filmmaker, because so many films move along and then they stop and there's a big ass fight scene and then they keep going. Jimmy Wang Yu keeps you going throughout the entire film with the fight scenes. I think that's really, really fantastic filmmaking, and that's one of the things that I'm really loving about his movies as I'm watching them. So and like I said, big influence. I'm a huge fan of Japanese cinema, and as I've said before on this channel, I almost started Japanese Cinema Appreciation Society instead of Hong Kong Cinema, and I lived in Japan and the whole 9 yards, right? So I've talked about this before on the channel, but like there's a scene in this movie where there's a fight inside of a mill. And there's these big wheels turning, big water wheels. Really reminds me of Seven Samurai. There's not a fight scene in a mill in Seven Samurai, but you know, there's that kind of like the wise village elder character in Seven Samurai who like lives in the mill. And there's those scenes where they're in the mill and the slow turning of the water wheel and the way that that creates ambiance in the scene and creates the tempo of the scene as well. With that kind of that sound and that movement. And then you have the burning of the mill in Seven Samurai 2. And so there's a lot of stuff that hinges around this mill, and it's a very clearly deliberately chosen location for Jimmy Wang Yu, and he talks about how he loved Mifune and he loved Seven Samurai in the interview that he gives on the release here. So that's kind of enough, I think, about my thoughts about the film. I'm going to show this off. You get this is, I believe, a limited edition slipcase to the first, and this was by Ilian Sheedy. Like I said, I'm sorry I'm not pronouncing the name correctly, but I really do just love that artwork. I didn't reverse it, see? So I got it here too, because it is a reversible cover here, and then you just have this original poster, and there is the booklet, and I will talk to you briefly about the booklet. So you have two essays in here. One is by David West, who I've read a fair amount of stuff from before, and I think I've seen interviews with David West as well, but I might be mistaking him for somebody else. And then you have Simon Abrams. So front of the book and the back of the book, and the David West essay is called Jimmy Wang Yu and the Birth of the Kung Fu Movie. So he kind of makes the case that Jimmy Wang Yu is a really underrated figure in the history of martial arts and Kung Fu films and action films kind of in general, especially in the kind of the United States, and I think the Western world kind of more at large. And he talks about his influence, and he talks about how, you know, you had barehanded combat in the Wong Fei-hung movies, which I think started in the 40s and went through the 50s and the 60s and stuff like that. And then you know, with the rise of the unpopularity of the Japanese swordplay films like the Kurosawa films and films like Harakiri and stuff like that, the Shaw brothers were like, oh, we should start making sword movies again. So then the wuxia films became huge again, thanks in part to like Come Drink With Me, which came out in 1966. And then in 1967, Jimmy Wang Yu himself was the one-armed swordsman, right? And that was a huge film and ushered in this whole era of like Chang Che and these new swordplay films. And then Jimmy Wang Yu kind of, he took some elements from Chang Che and the swordplay films, and he took some elements of like the hand-to-hand combat, the kind of brutal bare-knuckle fighting and stuff, and the more kind of grounded type of fighting in terms of like people aren't like flying around and stuff like that you might see in like the Wong Fei-hung type movies, and he kind of combined them. But whereas the Wong Fei-hung movies were very much kind of vessels for the transmission of Cantonese culture, and that they were in the Cantonese language, they were about Confucian ideals and stuff like that, and they were made to appeal specifically to people who had come to Hong Kong from China when the communists took over in China. Jimmy Wang Yu kind of threw that aspect of it out the window, and it just becomes like an action film. So he's taking a little bit from Shaw, a little bit from these Wong Fei-hung movies, but he's making something new, and it's a really cool overview of that history. Now, the Simon Abrams essay. Simon Abrams has become something of like we want to call him persona non grata in the Kung Fu martial arts Hong Kong movie community, because and I'm not going to go super into detail on this. I don't really care that much, to be honest with you, but he made errors. I haven't listened to this commentary track. For like full disclosure, this is just the kind of what I put together, the pieces of talking to people and reading posts about it and stuff like that. But there are a number of errors in his commentary on the Five Deadly Venoms on the ShotScope Volume 1 box set. And some people asked him about that. And I've seen screenshots of and tweets and stuff like that. Like, people were not confrontationally like being like, hey, you're an idiot, what did you do? Like, they were genuinely just asking him about it. And he was very defensive, and he like sent nasty messages and then deleted them, and was just kind of cranky about it and blamed people for like, oh, somebody tagged, I think, the guy who runs Arrow, and he was like, don't tag my boss, and blah, 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 blah. And so I don't think people are a really big fan of his these days. Now, what I will say is that I've only read, I believe, 2 things that he's written. I've read his piece in this booklet, and I've read his piece on King Boxer, which is in the ShotScope. He did like a write-up for that movie. And there's not really anything in the essay here that is not in something like in the David West essay, in the Frank Jane commentary, or the Jimmy Wang Yu interview. And I would say that Simon Abrams is the least interesting of the people who are conveying this information, right? So if you listen to the Frank Jane commentary and you watch the Jimmy Wang Yu interview, and then if you read the David West essay, you don't really need to read the Simon Abrams essay. He's not a writer who has a thesis about a film. He's not trying to make a point and tell you something about the film. He's kind of just describing Jimmy Wang Yu's career, and he's describing the film, and has some quotes from Jimmy Wang Yu and from Grady Hendrix, who's an author, has written about martial arts films and stuff like that. And I think he's also an organizer of the New York Asian Film Festival, if I'm not mistaken. So it's kind of like an overview type of thing. So if you want background information or whatever, but if you read, the other essay and you listen to the Frank Jane commentary, and if you watch the interview, you don't really need to read that essay. I don't think it adds a ton to the experience of watching the film and having this release. So now the Jimmy Wang Yu interview is absolutely freaking incredible. I feel bad for Region B people who have the Eureka release because they don't have this interview. Now, I have heard rumors that Eureka is going to put out more Jimmy Wang Yu films, and that interview will end up going on one of those releases because it's not specific to this film. It covers his entire career. It's truly incredible. Like, if you are a fan of Jimmy Wang Yu and you're in Region A especially, you have to buy this immediately because there's no reason not to. If you don't know Jimmy Wang Yu, I would say get Chinese BOXER and get this and have a double feature and get like your beer or your wine or if you don't drink, get your glass of tea or whatever you have, right? And just watch these movies, make some popcorn. They are incredible and fantastic. He's a great filmmaker. He's a great entertainer. And then watch this interview. It begins when the first questions are about him playing water polo and being a competitive swimmer in Shanghai in the 60s. Early 60s. And he explains this whole story about how he was banned from water polo because this is such a Jimmy Wang Yu story too. He got in a fight in the water during a water polo match. So he got banned for a year. I had heard that he had been banned from water polo, but I didn't know why. I didn't know it's because he just got in a fight with somebody in the water. If I'm understanding what he said correctly, which is I'm pretty sure that's what he said. So then he goes to Hong Kong. He talks about there was an open audition at Shaw. I didn't know this. He and Lo Lei, they started together, like they were at the same audition, and they began their career with Shaw together. And then he talks about how Raymond Chow was like his favorite person to work with at Shaw, and so why he went and left and worked with Golden Harvest. And he talks a lot about relationships in this. He talks about his relationship with Chang Che. He talks about his relationship with Lau Kar Lung. He talks about Cheng Pei Pei. This is really interesting. He talks about how Golden Swallow, which is the sequel to Come Drink With Me, actually took a while to get going because Cheng Pei Pei was not satisfied with the script. She didn't think that her character was strong enough and had enough agency and advanced enough from the first story to the second story. It wasn't good enough, basically. And I think that's really interesting. She really pushed them to make the script stronger, to make the character better. He talks about working with her. He talks about his relationship with Jackie Chan. Now, this is fascinating because the story everyone tells is that Jackie Chan was in Prison on Fire as a favor to Jimmy Wang Yu. It's even written in Jackie Chan's book that he did it as a favor to him because Jimmy Wang Yu helped him out early in his career, getting out of his contract with Lo Wei Films, right? So this is really interesting. Jimmy Wang Yu, I'm not going to tell you the story because you want to hear Jimmy Wang Yu tell it, but Jimmy Wang Yu basically says, that wasn't him doing me a favor. That was something different. And it's really, really interesting why he says that and why he thinks that. And you go and watch it for yourself and see it because, again, I don't want to spoil it for you. You should hear the story from him, but it's really cool. Oh, he talks about Shintaro Katsu. So you know that Jimmy Wang Yu was in the Zatoichi and the One-Armed Swordsman movie. And you know that I'm a huge fan of the Zatoichi movies. And I used to actually have my Criterion Zatoichi box set up on my shelf here in the background of my videos, but I ended up, there's so many Hong Kong movies over here, I didn't have room for it, so I moved it. But I love Zatoichi, and I love, like I said, Japanese films, and so he talks about, there's a different cut, there's a Hong Kong cut of Zatoichi and One-Armed Swordsman that's different from the Japanese version. And apparently, so if you know Flip Otaku, who also has a YouTube channel, he's a huge fan of Japanese cinema and those old school samurai movies, and he's actually asked around to people who were seeing these movies in theaters in the 60s and 70s and stuff like that, who are in their 70s and 80s now, I guess. And there was, these people have confirmed there is an alternate cut of that film, but no one knows anyone who has a print of it, who has the footage. So it's like it's unclear whether it's like a lost version of the film or whether that footage still exists somewhere. But there is an alternate version where the one-armed swordsman comes out on top of Zatoichi, and there's more fight scenes and stuff like that. So that sounds really cool. But Shintaro Katsu, you know, Katsu is like a legendary figure in Japanese cinema, and he talks about his relationship with him and stuff like that. It's really, really cool to hear him talk about him. They ask him about the triad stuff. So he's long rumored to have been a member of the triads and stuff like that. His answer is pretty funny. And then one other thing that he said that I thought was really funny was he talks about how he doesn't think some of his films have aged well. This interview is from 20 years ago, and he had recently re-seen some of his old movies in theaters, and he's like, I thought they were really good in the 60s, but I watched them now, I'm like, they're really kind of preposterous. And I thought that was a really funny take on the films from the man himself. So, and then one other thing I will leave you with about the Jimmy Wang Yu interview is he talks about the swords and how they had different types of prop swords in these movies, and depending on where the camera was and what the coordination and of the choreography of the fight scenes was, they would use different swords made out of different types of materials and stuff like that. That was really kind of interesting. So that's the Jimmy Wang Yu interview. I cannot emphasize enough that this is worth buying for the Jimmy Wang Yu interview alone. Fantastic. But also I just love this movie. So and then the Frank Jen commentary. So this is the same commentary that's on the Eureka release. I rewatched it because I wanted to give you some fresh takes on it and see if there was like kind of some stuff that struck me as really interesting this time that I didn't talk about in my last video. So you have some unique stuff for this video, and I did find some really, really cool stuff. So as always, Frank will translate the signs for you. So there'll be like signs in the background in the Chinese language, and Frank will be like, that means this and it relates to this, and that's the cultural context of this, and that's just so cool to hear that kind of stuff, right? This movie is in Mandarin, and Frank does talk about that too, and that's really interesting. And he talks about like who would dub Jimmy Wang Yu's voice, and how Jimmy Wang Yu has a very strong Shanghainese accent when he speaks in Mandarin, obviously because he's from Shanghai, and so he would deliberately pick a dubber who was from Beijing, who had like perfect Mandarin and this great powerful voice, and like he was very intelligent about stuff like that. And Frank talks about the way that the people speak Mandarin in this film, which is I would never know anything about. Like they're speaking in a certain rhythm, using a certain number of words per phrase. It's like really interesting the way that he kind of explains that. It's super, super cool. And then like I mentioned earlier, the success of Japanese films inspiring the Shaw studio to start making more swordplay films. Frank talks, that information is from Frank. He talks about that in his commentary track, and he goes into kind of more details on it. It's really, really cool. He talks about how people told Jimmy Wang Yu not to make Chinese Boxer because he was a huge star from swordplay films, and they're like, don't go and make like a fist movie, like beating people up with your fists. Don't make a fisting movie, Jimmy Wang Yu. Ooh, we're going off the rails. But suffice it to say, you know, Chong Che and people like that were like, don't make this movie. You have a reputation as this. You want to maintain that and be a star in that kind of niche. And he showed his script to Raymond Chow, and Raymond Chow was like really supportive and was like, this is really good. Like, you should make this movie. You should direct this movie. You should be in this movie. Like, I'm all for it. And it's really interesting to hear kind of like the ins and outs of how that worked and stuff like that. Yeah, so something else that Frank said that I thought was fascinating was he talks about how sound in 70s kung fu movies is basically all the same. Because they're using the same recorded samples of sword fighting and people going like, ha, like that kind of stuff, and like the punching sounds and all that stuff. And it wasn't until the late 70s when people started making a lot more contemporary set films with guns and with cars and things like that, and like in the city, that you needed to start bringing in a more contemporary landscape, and the sound elements in Hong Kong films started changing. That makes total sense, and it's very logical when you hear it said like that, but I never thought about that before. It's really fascinating. So the one other thing I want to tell you is Frank's tiny little blurb in the way he describes this movie, because this is the perfect description of this movie to me, and I think this will be a perfect way to end this review. He says, a classic, relentless, non-stop kung fu superhero extravaganza. What's not to love? We love Frank. That Jimmy Wang interview is incredible. Arrow always does great work. It's the one-armed boxer, the classic 1971 martial arts film. I'm going to put a link in the description of this video so where you could pick this release up. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. My name is Will. This is Hong Kong Cinema Appreciation Society. I thank you so much for watching, as always, and we will see you next time.